situation in Ireland. Now, I know that the stupidity and greed of Irish politicians has a lot to do with this. They should never ever have joined the euro. They suffered with low interest rates, a false boom and a massive bust. But look at your response to them. What they're being told, as their government's collapsing, is that it would be inappropriate for them to have a general election. In fact, Commissioner Wren here said they had to agree their budget first before they'd be allowed to have a general election. Just who the hell do you think you people are? You are very, very dangerous people indeed. Your obsession with creating this Euro state means that you're happy to destroy democracy. You appear to be happy for millions and millions of people to be unemployed and to be poor. Untold millions must suffer so that your Euro dream can continue. Well, it won't work, because it's Portugal next. With their debt levels of 325% of GDP, they're the next ones on the list, and after that, I suspect it'll be Spain. And the bailout for Spain would be 7 times the size of Ireland, and at that moment, all of the bailout money has gone. There won't be any more. But it's even more serious than economics, because if you rob people of their identity, if you rob them of their democracy, then all they are left with is nationalism and violence. I can only hope and pray that the Euro project is destroyed by the markets before that really happens.
Thank you. The next speaker, Madam.
Okay, so I thought twice about putting that in because he's such a good speaker. I said they're not going to listen to me after that guy. But the point is that's the pushback. That's not the majority opinion in Europe, but that is a very large segment of popular opinion. What he's saying is, why are the Irish people suffering austerity? Why are their elections being put off so you can pay the bondholders of the banks? Why not just stiff the bondholders, say, you know what, you made a bad investment, sorry, too bad for you, but we're going to spend more money at home and help employment. You're going to be hearing more about that in your hearing in this country. So let's flip to quantitative easing, one of our favorite subjects. And the number one question I get when I talk to people around the world, that there's a lot of confusion and people haven't seen an economy play out quite the way it is playing out now. The number one question I get is, are we in for inflation or deflation? Because if you tell me that, tell me the answer to that, then I know what to do. I know what kind of portfolio to construct and how to invest and all that. And the answer is, I don't know. But I do know the following, that all the data of price stability, PPI, CPI, producer price index, consumer price index, PC, price deflator, which is Bernanke's favorite measure of inflation, are all close to zero. They're what economists call well-behaved. But that's a little bit like saying California is geologically stable because it's not shaking right now. What's going on beneath the surface is you have a massive natural deflation, which happens when you get deleveraging and depression. There is policy-induced inflation, which is what's supposed to happen when you print $1 trillion. The inflation and the deflation are like these tectonic plates. They're coming together. It's not shaking right now, but it's unbelievably unstable, and it's going to break. So which way will it break? My view is that one of two things will happen. Either the Fed will get cold feet. There'll just come a time when the criticism is so great, the money printing is so extensive, the program is so unsuccessful, they'll just have to stop, whether it's politically or they actually believe that's the right thing to do. And then the deflation will take over. That's the natural sequence. My concern is that they'll have faith in their capacity to create inflation by money printing, but they'll find that that's a dynamically unstable process, and you'll go very quickly to hyperinflation. That it won't, this notion that you can dial it up to 2%, and if it gets to 2.5%, we'll dial it down a little bit. That may work in the thermostat in your home. It does not work in a complex system where there are tipping points and critical thresholds, and things can very quickly get away from you. So that's really my concern. If I had to guess right now, I would say that we'll have QE3, QE4, and a dollar collapse in due course, but we'll come back to that a little bit. So just to, another way to think about it is it's what I call the quantum of pain. And what I mean by that is when you misallocate capital, which is when interest rates are too low too long, it's too easy to borrow money, too easy to make bad investments, the threshold's really low. When you misallocate capital, the capital must be destroyed. It's non-productive, it doesn't pay its own cost of carry, and it must be destroyed. You can physically destroy it. Actually, blowing up houses, it would be one way to do it. Or you can financially destroy it by writing it down. Something that was 10 million is now going to be on your books at 5 million, and 5 million of capital has simply gone away. But we're not actually seeing that. What's happening is that the Fed is trying to prop up asset prices, maintain this system. I call it catching an anvil in midair. It's like, nice job catching the anvil. What's your next move? But that's kind of what they're doing now. Now, what you can do with these losses, you can shift them in time. Instead of concentrating them in a 1 or 2 year period, you can stretch them out over 10 years. The problem with that is, my view is that Americans have a high tolerance for pain and a huge appetite for growth. So if you say we're going to have a depression, we're going to have 18% unemployment, like we haven't seen since 1932, but once we wring all that rot out of the system, we're poised for very rapid growth after that. I think the American people have a tolerance for that. At least we have in the past. I'm not sure the American people have tolerance for 10 years or 20 years of no growth, because that's the alternative. That, again, you don't get robust growth. What you do is you stretch out the stagnation. The other thing you can do is you can shift the cost to different losers. In other words, the people who should lose are the banks and the bondholders who financed all this stuff. But instead, you can say, all right, we're going to bail out the bondholders and shift the loss to the taxpayers. Now, again, go back to my premise of the quantum of pain. The loss is still there, but we've shifted it from a deserving set of players to arguably an undeserving set of players, which are average citizen and taxpayers. I'm not sure politically that that's very stable. But these are kind of the only ways out. It's the V versus the L. Now, this is an illustration. This is the housing bubble. So a lot of you may have participated. It's just kind of normalized to 100. Go back to 2000. There are longer time series here, but 2000 to 2000, late 2006, early 2007 was the housing bubble. Now, obviously, the housing collapsed. But one thing about the dynamics of bubbles, and you can look at the Nikkei index, which was 40,000 in 1989. It's about 7,000 or 8,000 today. There are many, many examples I could give you. The NASDAQ, which was 5,000 in 2000 and is 2,000 something today, down. These numbers are down 60 or 80% from their peaks 10, 20, and 30 years after the peak. What happens in a bubble is that the collapse goes all the way down to the starting point and usually overshoots. In other words, my forecast for housing would be it's down here, it's below where it started, down another 30% from where it is today. I know that's not news that anybody wants to hear, but that's how bubbles work. So what happened here? It went back up. Look, how did that flatten out? That's the first-time homebuyer tax credit. We spent the money, we printed the money, we kept that thing from going lower, but what happened? Remember, there were two. It went back up a little bit. Then they got to the end of the homebuyer tax credit. It collapsed again, and then they came up with a new tax credit to get it going. Now that's over, and look what's happening. It's going down again. In other words, this is like a force of nature. This propping up is policy, and it works for a while, but it's not free because you're destroying the dollar in the process. You're debasing the dollar. Now, if you get to a self-sustaining recovery, things get better, growth goes up, you tax more, you pay back the debt, you unwind the whole transaction. But that is not happening. It's not happening because this never got down to there. And that's what I mean by the quantum of pain. That's why this is I understand this in dynamic space. So the Fed wants inflation. Because inflation, 4% inflation for 17 years cuts the value of the dollar in half. And that 100 trillion I talked about, if it's 50 trillion, we might be able to pay 50 trillion. We just can't pay 100 trillion. So they need that kind of inflation. The Fed chairman says 2%. That is not true. He wants 4. My problem is you don't get 2, you don't get 4, you get 12 or -5. But the idea that you can fine tune it is, I think, an illusion. So let's talk a little bit about how you try to get inflation anyway, which is, of course, by printing money. Now, this is what most people consider to be money, but it's actually a contract between you and your government. This is a contract between the citizens and the United States government. And I always say, as a lawyer, read the fine print, read the contract. So let's just take this contract out of your pocket and read it. And the first thing I notice is the word note. Now, where I went to law school, a note was a liability, and indeed it is. When the Fed prints money, it shows up as a liability on the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve System. So you can call it money, and it is, legal tender over there, but it's really debt. It's debt issued by a central bank. And so even what we call money is really debt. And we use it to incur more debt, more leverage, so it's all debt. There's very little capital left in the world. And so printing money, just if you say printing debt every time you hear that, you kind of get a little insight into how that works. Now, why are we not getting the inflation? I heard someone say the other day, this government isn't even competent enough to produce inflation. They're not even doing a good job of debasing the dollar. Well, there's a reason for that. The reason is China. Because of the exchange rate mechanism between the United States and China, because China has pegged the yuan to the dollar, they have in effect outsourced their monetary policy to us. Now, they didn't think we would do this to them, but we are. And so what's happening is if you're a Chinese exporter and you ship goods to the United States and you get paid in dollars, the People's Bank of China says you have to hand those dollars over to them, and they give you yuan. They give you some local currency. Then you can use that to meet your payroll and pay your suppliers and all that stuff, so that's fine. But in order to soak up the quantity of dollars that we're pumping out and keep that exchange rate fixed, they've got to flood their own system with their own currency. So they're getting inflation in China. They're getting a lot of inflation in China, but it's coming from Washington. In other words, they're importing our inflation through the exchange rate mechanism. That's why we're not getting the inflation we want. And that's why Bernanke's not getting any traction. What's going on now is an extremely dangerous, high-stakes game of chicken between China and the United States, where the Federal Reserve is trying to break the peg between the yuan and the dollar by creating so many dollars that the Chinese finally choke on it and have to break the peg, revalue the yuan upwards, raise their own interest rates to get a lid on their inflation. When that happens, and watch for that, because when that happens, the inflation is coming back home. You're going to see the inflation in this country. We won't be exporting it to China anymore. One problem. Why did China set that peg in the first place? So that their exports would be competitive, so they could create jobs, because they got 25 million people a year marching in from the countryside saying, give me a job. And if they don't get a job, they've got political instability. So they're between a rock and a hard place. They're either going to revalue the yuan upwards, which could put a lid on inflation but hurt exports and create social instability, or they're going to keep the peg, which creates inflation, which creates social instability. So China is in a very, very tenuous position. I think what the Chinese are doing, what they will do, is price controls. In other words, they're going to try to have it both ways. They're going to try to keep the peg, but put a lid on inflation. Now, price controls usually don't work. In the long run, they won't work in China, but they have a much more coercive society. They still use firing squads when it suits their purposes. And they put on serious price controls, and then a couple of months go by, they'll find a violator, stand them up in front of a firing squad, shoot the guy, and that's like a message to them. So they might be more successful than some other countries, at least in the short run, at actually putting on price control. So this battle could go on a while longer and could become a lot more unstable as the Fed continues to print money to break the peg. But that's what's going on between the U.S. and China. Very, very high-stakes stuff. Now, what is it what's the other thing that's causing inflation not to pick up in the United States? Well, this, again, another very simple, it's not even it's barely an equation, it's really a tautology, but it's good for thought experiments. This is the monetarist holy grail, right? So it's money, M is money supply, V is velocity, P is a price index, and Y is real growth. Yeah. So what it says is take the amount of money, multiply it by the turnover in the money, and that equals nominal growth, which has two components, inflation and real growth. What's velocity? Well, velocity is, I take a taxi to the airport tonight, and I pay the taxi driver a tip. He goes out and buys a cup of coffee, and the guy who sold him the coffee buys a present for his daughter, right? So that money had velocity of 3. That $1 got turned over 3 times. But if I take $1 and put it in the bank, that has velocity of 0. Now, in the real world, there's all different kinds of things going on with the money, so you look at it as an aggregate. But the problem is, if velocity is going down, which it is, you have to print money just to stay even. You have to print money just to keep the GDP from going down. And if velocity goes down 50%, your economy goes down 50%, from 14 trillion to 7 trillion, unless you double the money supply. So this is the other battle that Bernanke's fighting. Not only that the fact that the Chinese are taking the inflation that he's trying to get, but he's he's running up a hill with a